Recently I saw a discussion on social media about knitting in the cinema, and some people were very supportive and some people were very negative about it and very judgmental about it. So I thought about places where it is appropriate to knit and places where some people don't think it's appropriate to knit. And I thought we'd have a chat about it today. So make sure you share your views and comments in the comments below this video. I'm really interested in hearing what other people have to say on this subject as well. And I'll share my views and reflections on this in today's video. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. So a little comment from me editing this video. I keep saying knitting, but I mean knitting or crochet. So every time I say, would you knit? I'm also thinking, would you crochet? Just because I mainly knit. I do crochet as well, but not very often. And I haven't crocheted in public for quite a long time. So I'm mainly saying knitting, but if you're a crocheter, would you crochet in public? And is there a difference between you knitting and crocheting in public? So everything I'm saying about knitting also does apply to crochet. So I just wanted to add that little bit here before we get into the rest of the video. If you're new here, my name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns, I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website YarnAddict.co.uk. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. I post videos at the moment. I do twice a week. One video is a podcast where I talk about what I'm knitting, yarn purchases, new designs, different things like that. And then the other video is either I talk about a knitting related topic or I share a tutorial on something. I tend to mix it up a little bit, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. And if you have any requests for any videos, tutorials, topics you'd like me to talk about, please leave them in the comments below. Let's start with this discussion I saw on social media about knitting in the cinema. Now, I regularly knit in the cinema, and I have done for many, many years. I mainly knit something fairly easy, mainly stocking stitch if I'm knitting in a round, or something very simple if I'm knitting back and forth. But I have knitted things like cable sweater once in the cinema. I've done a heel turn once in the cinema. Mostly now these days I just knit plain socks, and I try and make sure I have plenty to keep me going on the straight bits of the socks. And recently I've also knitted a couple of hats in the cinema, or knitted on a couple of hats in the cinema. So I tend to take something fairly easy with me, something which means I can just knit quietly and not disturb anyone around me. I find that because I tend to use thinner needles, and even though I do use metal needles, they don't click a lot. In my experience, it seems to be bigger needles that make that sort of click-clack noise more than thinner needles. And my husband usually sits next to me in the cinema, and he's never bothered by it. I've only once had someone complain at me knitting in the cinema. It was, I can't remember what film it was years ago. But it was completely full. There weren't any available seats. And I sat there knitting, doing all the ads and like previews and things. And the person next to me said nothing. And the seats at the cinema we go to are quite big. So there's quite a lot of space between you and the person next to you. They're not like right up against your arm or anything, because the seats are quite big. And this person didn't say anything until the lights went down and the film started. And then she said, would you mind not knitting, because it's just disturbing me or something. I can't remember what she said. And I was a bit like, really? And I was a bit taken aback. But at the same time, I didn't want to have a big row because the film was starting. If I could have moved, I would have moved. And I probably should have just asked Simon to swap with me, because I would have been fine. But I didn't for some reason. Normally, I book an aisle seat. So I'm at the aisle and Simon is next to me. So then it's not a problem because there's nobody the other side of me. But this time it was particularly busy, so I didn't. So I did put my knitting down because I didn't want to get in a row. But I, on purpose, because I was annoyed, I made sure I fidgeted as much as I possibly could. And I probably on purpose tried to deliberately annoy the person next to me, because that's the kind of childish person I can be sometimes. I don't feel proud about it, but I was really annoyed. But normally I would just move. But I've never had another experience where I've had a negative reaction to knitting in public. And I knit a lot in public. I knit just about everywhere. Going back to this cinema discussion on, I think it was on Threads actually, I sort of commented that I knit in cinema a lot. Some people thought that was inappropriate. And I said, well, I knit in cinema, I knit more or less everywhere. And somebody commented on my post saying, well, would you knit in church? Would you knit at a funeral? And I replied saying, well, actually, I did used to knit in church, but no, I wouldn't knit at a funeral. We haven't been going to church for the last 5.5 years, for various reasons. We changed churches and then we just never got into the new church properly. And then the pandemic started and then we just never gotten back into going to church. But the church we used to go to, I did used to knit in that church. I didn't to start with, but I was at a leadership meeting and I was knitting because we were still waiting for people to arrive. And the pastor got chatting to me about my knitting, and I said, well, do you mind if I knit during the meeting? And he said, no. And I said, well, would you mind if I knit during church? And he said, no, I don't mind. He said, you know, people write and take notes and fall asleep and do all kinds of other things. So he said, I don't mind. So I did then start knitting during the sermon in that church. If we went to church somewhere else for any reason, then I didn't tend to knit because they wouldn't necessarily know me, but I think people who went to our church got used to the fact that I was usually there knitting. Occasionally after the service, I might get comments from somebody who maybe was new or I hadn't seen for a long time or who hadn't noticed that I was knitting in the service, and then might comment on it. But most of the time, nobody cared. I was making sure that I took knitting with me that I didn't have to look at. I can knit without looking at my knitting the whole time. So I would sit there knitting and looking up, paying attention, and nobody would know I was knitting. A lot of people in that church would take notes during the sermon, so they were looking down all the time. And an awful lot of people would be nodding off during the sermon, and at least I didn't do that. So I think I paid attention better than some other people did. I wouldn't knit at a funeral. The last two funerals I attended were family members, my mother-in-law and my sister. And both those funerals were quite emotional, especially my sister's funeral. I wouldn't have dreamt of knitting during either of those funerals. I wouldn't knit at a funeral anyway, to be quite honest, unless it happened to be a knitter who said, I would like, if you can knit at my funeral. If that was kind of the request, then I would. But generally speaking, I wouldn't take my knitting to a funeral. I can manage to not knit for a few hours. I also wouldn't take my knitting to other formal occasions like weddings, christenings, any kind of, if I was invited to some religious thing from a religion I wasn't familiar with, some religious celebration or any formal celebration, if you were invited to a sort of formal party or anything like that, I don't tend to take my knitting. But I do knit waiting for hospital and doctor's appointments. I've knitted at the hairdressers while having my hair highlighted. I don't knit while they put all the stuff in, but when you're just sitting there with the whatever they put in your hair working, the colour and stuff, I quite often knit. I also wouldn't knit while they cut my hair because I don't want my knitting to be covered in hair. I've knitted on public transport, planes, trains, buses, cars when I'm not driving, obviously. I've knitted airports, on the beach. I used to knit. I always knit on the beach when we go to places like Spain and it's really hot. I knit on the beach. I knit in coffee shops, pubs, restaurants. If we're going out for like a family meal or with friends or family, I don't always tend to knit, but if it's me and Simon, I will quite often knit. I used to knit at school meetings, which my kids didn't like. So if it was like a parents' meeting in the main hall, my kids would be like, don't knit, Mum. And if the girls were sitting with us, I wouldn't knit. But if the girls would go and sit with their friends at the front, for example, and we were sitting, let's say, at the back, I would sometimes knit because some of those things are incredibly boring. If we were waiting to see the teacher for like parent-teacher conference, the girls would say, don't knit. But sometimes if it was a long time to wait, I would sometimes knit because otherwise I would get a bit annoyed. Because sometimes you might have an appointment for, say, 7 and you sit there for like half an hour to 45 minutes waiting because they were running late. So I did sometimes knit on those occasions. And if the girls weren't there, then I would knit. But especially when they were teenagers, they weren't very keen on me knitting at school events. But I would if I didn't embarrass them too much, I would still knit. And the only time I've had a negative reaction to my knitting was that one time in the cinema. I had my gallbladder removed many years ago, and after the operation, I felt really good. I've had quite a few operations, and usually I feel really sick afterwards. So I told the anaesthetist that I normally get really sick. So I think they must have given me lots of anti-sickness medication, because I felt really good afterwards. And I asked, when I was in the recovery room, at some point I asked the nurse to pass me my bag, which was underneath my bed, because it was like a day surgery only. And I pulled my knitting out and started knitting. So when the nurse saw me knitting, she said, right, I think you're probably well enough to go home. Do you want to get dressed and then call your husband to come and get you? And yeah, I've knitted in most places, and most of the time the reaction has been very positive. Some people might stare at you a bit, which doesn't bother me. Some people might comment. I've had people comment at me from across the room. I've asked people when I'm knitting. Sometimes people think they're funny and say, oh, haven't you finished that thing yet? You know, if I've been sitting there for a while, or, you know, people may sort of silly comments that they think is funny, which as knitters we've probably heard a million times before, and we're probably like, but you just kind of smile and polite and make some comment back, you know. But I've never had a problem with the fact that I'm knitting in public. I know from looking at the YouTube analytics that most people who watch my videos are women. But if you're a man watching this who knits, I'm assuming if you're watching this, you're probably a knitter. So if you're a man watching this who knits, do you knit in public, and what's the reaction? Do you get people comment on the fact that you're a man who knits? Do they think that's fantastic? Do they patronize you because you're a man who knit? Are they shocked? Are they surprised? Do they say, oh, I didn't know men knitted, or whatever? Tell me what reaction you've had to the fact that if you knit in public, or if you're a man, do you not knit in public because you're worried about what people might say? Let me know, because I'm particularly interested in hearing about men's experiences, because I wonder whether they're different from women's experiences. So I can think about two specific situations that I thought I'd discuss, because it does demonstrate how reactions to men and women knitting may be different. I mean, most of you know what Wimbledon is. It's tennis competition in the UK every May, June time, I don't know, sometime early summer. And I've never been to a tennis match, but to me it looks very boring. And certainly if I was to go to one, I would definitely bring my knitting. And there's been a few times I've seen, you know, in the papers, on the front pages, on the front page of the paper or something, it's been like, woman knits at Wimbledon, how awful. She's not paying attention, she's not concentrating, she's being disrespectful to the players, all kinds of negative stuff. And she's had a picture splashed on the front page of the newspapers. I'm sure that's happened more than once. And it's been mentioned on the news and all kinds of stuff, and how disrespectful it is and blah, blah, blah. And then, I don't think it was the last Olympics, I think it might have been the ones before that. There was a big thing about Tom Daley knitting at the Olympics. Tom Daley is a British diver. I think he may have retired after the last Olympics last summer, but he is actually local to where I live. He is from Plymouth, which is the nearest town to where I live. It's about half an hour away. So we used to get loads by his career when he was like a teenager, when he first started winning competitions. But he's a very successful diver, won Olympic golds and loads of other medals. He's also a knitter, and he has a knitting and crochet business. He has a yarn business, and he does now a lot of knitting and crocheting on Instagram, and I guess also TikTok. But he's quite well known in the knitting world for being a knitter, and I don't think anyone in the knitting world are probably surprised that he's knitting, because it's been covered by magazines and social media accounts and all kinds of stuff. But he was knitting at the Olympics, and I don't think it was last year. I think it was the previous Olympics to that, but might have been last year as well. But that was also on the front pages of the papers and covered in the papers and the news and discussion programs and telly and all that kind of stuff. But the comments seem to be a lot more positive than women being photographed knitting at Wimbledon. Nobody seemed to think that he was being disrespectful to the other competitors at the Olympics when he was sitting watching other competitions. So this wasn't him knitting like back wherever they hang out when they're not competing. This was him sitting watching other people compete, knitting. And the reactions seem to be a lot more positive from what I can remember, compared to when women are seen knitting at public events like that. So I do wonder whether there is a bit of misogyny mixed in with that because fewer men knit, it's viewed differently than when women knit. I don't know, but it just seemed, those two examples do seem to kind of stick in my mind very different. He was like, oh, he's a young man who knits, how fantastic. Whereas the woman knitting in Wimbledon was like, oh, how disrespectful, how dare she. So let me know what you think about that. Have you noticed the same thing? Can you think of any other examples? Also quite often see, you know, actors and actresses who are knitting on film sets and things like that, and it gets commented on in the papers. Recently it was I can't remember her actual name. AOC, the American representative, House of Representatives, I think it is. I only know her as AOC. I can't remember her name. I mean, obviously I'm in England, so I'm not that familiar with American politicians. But she was seen knitting. Somebody shared something I saw on Instagram a few weeks ago about her knitting on a train or something and talking about politics. Michelle Obama knits, and that's been made a big thing of. So a lot of famous people knit, but the most famous people I've seen who knit tend to be women. I don't very often see comments made about famous men who knit. But apart from Tom Daley, I'm just wondering whether men knitting in public get a different reaction to women. More positive because it's more unusual to see men knit. So let me know what you think. Are there places that you think is appropriate to knit? Are there places where you don't think is appropriate to knit? Where would you knit? Where do you not knit? I don't tend to knit when I'm walking, for example, or if I'm standing in a queue, I don't tend to knit. If I was going to a theme park, like, I don't know, Disney World, somewhere like that, where you tend to queue for a long time, I might do because I don't like queuing and I'm not very patient. If I'm queuing at like the post office or something, I don't tend to pull out my knitting. Just because I don't can't be bothered. I might scroll on my phone or something instead. But yeah, let me know what you think about knitting in public and what the reaction has been. Share any examples you have or reactions people have had to you knitting in public, negative, positive. Make sure you're respectful in the comments. If somebody says, well, I don't think you should knit in XYZ place, be respectful of that. We're all sharing our opinions. I'm asking you to share your opinion. So please be respectful of what other people share and don't criticize them if you think they're wrong. But tell me in the comments what your views on this topic are. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. And I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.